Step into realms where the heart takes flight, where strategy meets the edge of night. The Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Prepare your mind. Now be our guest.
What if you could go back in time and change an action that you had taken that resulted in some dire consequence? Wouldn't that be an amazing power? Truth is, that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about the idea of retconning or retroactive continuity. Retconning is an idea that has been around in gaming for a very long time, and what it means is going backwards in time and either taking back an action or changing what has happened. And it sort of breaks the fourth wall and changes the way that the game is flowing and everything that has occurred after that point sometimes. But should we allow such things to take place in our storytelling, or should we leave them as they lie? I'm Robert Walker, author of Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system, and this is my show where I teach collaborative storytellers how to have more immersive campaigns using psychology. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about retconning and discussing it with our guest.
Hello, guys. This is Dustin Archer. I am your resident airship master and fleet commander of all things flying and floating, and I am excited to talk to you guys today about retconning.
Yes, we're very excited to have Dustin back on the show today. He was with us in Season 1 on mini episodes, and you can catch him on that if you want to go back and give a listen to anything he's talked about before. But today we are talking about whether or not retconning is an appropriate thing for a dungeon master to do and what situations it should be acceptable in, what situations maybe not, and also the different types of retconning, whether you're retconning in a story or whether you're retconning in combat, because they can have two very, very different implications depending on the situation. So let's just kick things off. Dustin, overall, general thoughts. Retconning favorable towards it or unfavorable towards it?
Well, for some of the newer cyclithids, I think it's important just to define what we're talking about. Retconning means something happens in the game and the GM says, no, that didn't happen. Let's go back to some point in the past before that happened. So generally, it breaks story continuity. It generally should be avoided, but sometimes it's absolutely, I think, necessary for the story to go back and do that. A great example of this is in combat. If, for example, there's a critical moment where a PC dies because they didn't calculate their AC correctly. They had a 25 AC. They told the GM they had a 24. The 24 let a critical hit through, and they died. Well, then the player learns 2 minutes later, no, I actually had a 25 because of that buff this other PC put on me. Okay, that's a time where, since there's a major consequence to the story continuity is going to be broken one way or another, either by having a PC die, which is always going to break story continuity to a certain degree, or to go back when it really shouldn't have killed that PC. That's one of those moments where I think it's important to say, okay, let's go back to that moment in time, and everyone is making the same decisions other than the decisions that would have been influenced by based on whether that character lived or died. I don't want to give the rest of the characters knowledge of the future too much of what's going on. So as a GM, if I'm doing that, I may change the actions of anything declared by any of the monsters or stuff like that. But generally speaking, what do you think about roles? Should roles be redone or should roles remain the same as they were?
My overall opinion on retconning is it's so situational. I think you're right about if it is something that has really, really drastic implications for the party, that's when you really need to consider how important it is to allow the retcon to take place. Roles are one of those things that I really don't like to retcon almost in any situation.
Sure.
If the character has made the check, their dice has left their hands, it's clattered across the table, regardless of what I'm doing there, I kind of like that to be the outcome.
It's the moment of magic.
Right.
You can't change. That's the destiny of the dice.
And I've always said the dice know the story. So if that's the story the dice are trying to tell, I want I want them to still be able to tell that story, even if we go back and say, okay, wait, before you made that roll, this one little thing happened, but we're still sticking with that as the result of your roll.
So I understand what you're talking about. Let's say you have to go back half a combat round and the monsters have gone and 2 other PCs have gone when that PC discovers they actually didn't die because their AC was higher.
Right.
And you as a GM make the call to retcon back to that moment. You change that PC didn't die. Do you allow the PCs to make new actions? Do you allow the monsters to make new actions? And if you don't, do you make them stick with the same roles they had?
That's a really tricky one, especially in character death, because if you are going back 2 or 3 people's turns, I get really hesitant about going back even that far.
Sure.
I honestly, I think like if the next character has not begun their turn, then sure, retcon away almost like, oh, wait, hold on. Before we move on to the next person's turn, I just realized my AC is 2 points higher because of the spell that's affecting me right now. That actually wouldn't have hit. Okay, cool. Nothing has progressed in the story. No other actions have taken place. I don't have any problem with retconning that.
You can almost narrate through that in such a way that it's really, in my mind, not retconning. Retconning literally means changing actions that took place more than changing results. So my thought process on it is, generally speaking, if the PC's actions that they took don't have anything to do with the character who didn't die, that should be kept exactly. They shouldn't be allowed to rechange the actions, and whatever dice they rolled are the same.
Right.
Now, in the instance that, let's say, for example, a healer knew their friend was dead, decided to attack the enemy, and then realized, oh no, this person's still alive, I want to go heal them instead. They want to change the action. My thought is whatever dice they used to attack the enemy are the same dice they're rolling, the same number that they received should be the number they get for the new action they're doing as well, so they don't have a new opportunity to roll if a roll is called for.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the real situations in which as a DM, I'm okay with jumping back a few characters' turns or even a round or two is when I did not do my job as a dungeon master properly and either explain the scenario in which the characters found themselves or give them the right information to make the appropriate decisions. So I think actually I can think back to a scenario in which you were running a game, Dustin, that I was playing in, and we had a whole group of characters go into this combat. And I think your initial description of the creature we were facing was, oh, it's a weak-looking goblin with a stick.
Oh, yes.
And,
I remember that.
And so we're like, oh, it's a weak-looking goblin with a stick. Let's all jump in there. And then we go to find out it was like, well, actually, he's wearing wizarding robes, and it wasn't a stick. He had a staff of power or whatever it was.
Staff of fire.
Staff of fire. And when we also had characters in the party who probably would have recognized the arcane significance of such things, which we brought up at the table, and we're like, wait, hold on. Can we take a step back? Like, half the party's arcane casters, we probably would have recognized that was a staff.
Well, that was early enough in our gaming career that I think it was the retcon of TPK that really shouldn't have happened as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, that I absolutely agree. That's something when the GM didn't take the time to describe it, which comes down to when you are facing an enemy who isn't what they appear, the GM really does need to take the time to describe what the characters see and not necessarily explain what that means, but at least give them enough that they can say, wait a second, this goblin doesn't look like a normal goblin. What's going on? So you don't have to go back and retcon that.
Right. And I think at the time it did get retconned because, first of all, we brought it up. Hey, did you explain that correctly? And I think your immediate response at the time was, I don't think I did explain that right. Because at the beginning of this combat, I said that was just a goblin with a stick. Realistically, this scenario would have looked much differently if I described it. But we were in a hurry. I think we were close to the end of the night.
Sure.
There was all these other factors. But that is a very good point. The DM does have to do their due diligence in explaining to the characters what it is they're facing, or if they're setting up a scenario in which the creature they're facing or the story piece they're entering is meant to be deceptive, then I think that needs to be taken into account too. If it was a goblin disguising themselves as very weak and their staff was being disguised as a simple walking stick, yeah, then it's a trap, more or less, right?
But then there needs to be checks rolled. Even if they're private checks, the GM rolls, and I didn't in that particular instance, and in retrospect, that's what I should have done.
Right. I think, yeah, if we had gone into the combat and you had been like, okay, everybody needs a perception check.
Or knowledge arcana.
Or
even.
knowledge arcana.
And if they get a natural 1 and then I describe it as that, okay, it is what it is. You
Right.
failed the check. But if if I didn't give them the opportunity. So, I mean, I think this kind of touches on the nature of retconning holistically. And what I mean by that is retconning, it's kind of a minor failure, typically of the GM, if the GM is the reason for the retcon. If it's a player not knowing, I mean, we have players who played for, 2 months or 20 years. So that's, that can happen to any of us. So that should be given some grace. But when the GM is the one who makes the decision or describes something wrong or gives the wrong dice and has to retcon that, it's turning a major failure or a disaster that could end the campaign into something that's just a little breaking story continuity. So it's the best of the worst situations. So I think it's still important to be willing to do that as opposed to have a catastrophe ruin your whole game.
I agree. So that most of what we've talked about so far has to do with retconning in combat scenarios. Everything we've talked about, the examples we've given have all been in combat situations that we found ourselves in the past. But it's a little bit different when you're talking about a story scenario or a narrative piece that is being retconned. And if I'm trying to think of an example for that, maybe rolling a sleight of hand check against a guard or something, and then the guard sees you, and the character says, "Oh wait, no, I shouldn't have done that," or "Oh wait, no, my check might have actually been higher, so it would have changed the result of the guard being able to catch the player or not." Or it could just be a simple scene in a tavern where the characters are gambling or something and they make their roll and they lose their money, and then they realize, oh wait, no, I have, this bonus to my profession, gambling. At this point, would that have made a difference? And now all of a sudden they won the bet instead of lost the bet. So those are like story element pieces that could be examples.
Even though there's not a direct like conflict or combat going on, that's still a lot of the roles. I think all those same rules apply that we were talking about in combat retconning to that kind of a retcon. When I think of story retcon, I'm thinking of when the characters had information that was given to them that they knew, and they were given an opportunity to use that information. But while it wasn't clear to the players that they were given that opportunity, it would have absolutely been clear to their characters.
Yeah.
So the players declare actions, and the GM has to say, hold on, before those actions go back, let's roll an intelligence check. Let's remember some of this information. And I think that can avoid some of those RP related retcons, because in many cases, let's say the PCs are going to rescue someone and they have a description of what it is. And they see this person dressed in the enemy cultist's robes and they immediately move to attack it. Well, the GM at that point can kind of retcon the player's actions and say, well, before that happens, roll an intelligence check. Sure. Oh, you recognize this girl as the description that you were given. So that still is kind of a retcon because the PCs declared their actions and the GM went back on that. But I think that's a great example of when retconning is useful in a story context.
I think that's the same sort of retconning that you were speaking about earlier in combat, is that if the other actions actually haven't followed through yet, the DM can arbitrate that retcon through narrative. They can tell the story and remind the players that here's this other piece maybe you have forgotten as a player that your character probably hasn't forgotten.
Sure. But you said it earlier when we were talking about the combat side, you really don't want to go back any further than you absolutely have to. And you get beyond a certain point, you almost just can't retcon it. Especially, I mean, in combat, even I think beyond a round, I think trying to retcon that really breaks the continuity, that if there's any way to move forward without retconning, once enough time has passed, that should typically be done. And if it ends up being a character death, not character death thing, I've actually retconned that in the past with, well, he looked dead. But in retrospect, 2 rounds later, you realize he actually is still breathing, just barely. And, you can kind of play with that, have the narrative continue on, even though it may not be perfectly in line with the rules. At least it fits the story better. But you go to, when we're talking about the other side of it, the RP more, the story-related retcons, you get past a certain point of no return in the story, and it really, truly breaks the fourth wall, the illusion that keeps the game going. So I think that's a situation where when you're retconning for story reasons, it needs to be within a very, very short window, 5 to 10 minutes of when stuff happens. Because if it's, 3 hours ago, we would have learned this and this would have changed that. You almost have to find a way as a GM to narrate through that challenge rather than retconning back to that moment.
I definitely, when I think about what retconning looks like, because I'm trying to think of very clear ways to explain it here to the audience, but when I think about what it looks like, if any of you have ever seen The Gamers, there's this great scene where the rogue explains their action, sneaks into a room, gets hit by a trap, and then 3 or 4 more times, it goes, oh, wait, no. What I actually meant was I was moving very carefully into the room. Oh, wait. No, what I meant, I was on my hands and knees, moving 1 inch at a time, looking at everything top to bottom to avoid the traps. Because I know that they're in there.
Right.
I'm a rogue. Right. So they just keep adding on to what they're doing and trying to metagame, essentially, for their character to be able to do what they expect their character should be able
Which
to
is
do.
a wonderful example of retconning that shouldn't take place.
Exactly.
If I remember correct, they just sent the barbarian in to take the damage from the trap.
Just
And-
absorb the trap fireball and carry on.
And realistically speaking, a talented rogue might actually suggest that in the first place, depending on the nature of the trap and the danger and whatnot. But they're not necessarily going to know in character how hard a particular trap is most of the time. So that's a kind of example where I think the GM shouldn't allow the retcon, even if it causes something as dramatic as a character death, because that just continues the story moving forward.
Right. All right, let me throw a couple of retcon scenarios at you and get your just off the cuff, how would you handle it as
Sure.
a DM? All right, first one, character rolls the dice, immediately decides that they want to change their action, grabs the dice right after it leaves their hand and hits the table and says, wait, that's not what I want to do.
If no other player at the table saw the results, I would let them make the change that they want to make the change. If any other player saw what the die roll was, I wouldn't say I know that. I would just ask, hey, did anybody see the result? Someone said 17. I would say, okay, fair enough, but what do you want to do? Yeah. Ask the player what they want to do and say, okay, you got a 17 on that. Let's see how that works.
Okay.
Still
okay.
hold them accountable to the dice, but still let them change the action if nothing else has happened.
Another dice-related one. Character says, I'm sneaking into this room. Here's my stealth check. They roll the dice clatters, rolls off the table, falls on the ground, but it is a number side up. It's not on its side or anything. Re-roll or take the result from the ground.
We'll be right back.
Hey, Cyclithids, if you love the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology podcast and want to help keep it alive, there are a ton of ways you can support the show. Join us on Patreon for exclusive content like NPC character sheets, early access to new products, and even first looks at DM's Assistant app. You can also grab gaming-inspired merch on the Etsy shop, Games for Games, or pick up one of my books, The Player's Handbook to Real Life, or Session Zero, the DMG to writing great campaigns in any system. And even if financial support isn't in the cards for you, you can still help by sharing the show, leaving reviews, or introducing new players to our community. Links are always in the show notes, and thank you for being the heart of our adventure.
My preference and the way I actually handle that are different. I let my players tell me at the beginning of the game, and I've gamed with most of us for a long enough time that I know, we always call it book roller or not book roller. Does it count anywhere it falls, or does it only count if you're rolling it on a certain surface? And I know for those individuals, whether it counts or not, you kind of allow that. Personally, for me, I don't think if it's off the table, it should ever count. It should always be re-rolled because the whole point of the table is so everybody can see the result, and everyone can't see the result if it's hiding in the carpet.
Sure. Okay. I mean, that makes sense. I don't know. There's something sort of dramatic about the dice going tumbling across the ground and being like, what's the number? What's the number? What is it?
It's true. You give that up a little bit for accuracy and, integrity with the game, I suppose.
Okay. So rogue sneaking into a dungeon fails their perception check to detect a trap. The trap goes off. The rogue is hit with a lot of damage. However, the bard cast a Inspire Competence earlier. They forgot to add that effect in. It would have changed the result, but we have traveled through an additional room.
So this is a wonderful example of using the narration to minimize the damage of retconning. I would absolutely retcon that situation because they would have seen it. And I would treat it as the rogue had a premonition of what was about to happen. And I would retcon back to the moment the rogue made the perception check. And then I would tie that premonition into maybe a spectral presence in the area and use that as a different story thread that the players could explore. Because the rogue's like, hold on, guys, I just saw this. And maybe everybody else saw this premonition too, and have it be that.
Okay. Here's a non-role based one. 2 party members discussing something with an enemy or an ally, doesn't really matter. One of the party members makes an in-character statement. the player next to them says, no, don't say that. Say it like this instead. Is that statement already made, or is that not retconnable?
Well, I like to give my players as much agency as possible. And typically in that scenario, you're going to see the more experienced player telling the newer player not to say that. So I would rather the newer player not only have a greater agency in the game, but also be able to live with the consequences of their actions. So in that instance, no. They said it, and we're going to go from there.
Okay. I actually like that. I think for the most part, I would probably do that too. I'm not one of those DMs that is going to say that everything that's said at the table is being said in character.
Sure.
I've never played like that. But, if they put on their character voice and say it to my face, to the NPC that I'm playing, I'm going to usually take that as what was said. And if somebody else jumps in and says, no, don't say that, my NPC would usually but sir, she already said it. Can't take it back.
Exactly.
Something like that.
And that ties into that whole other, is it in character or is it out of character? And I think that obviously groups can do this in different ways. We've experimented over the years with, okay, a hand over your chest is out of character. And if you're saying it without that, it's in character. We've had sticks you pass around for the person who's doing the in character thing. There's 100 different ways to do it. And I think it's just a matter of what works for your individual table, whether it's in character or out of character. But once you've established that, then you shouldn't retcon it.
And I think you should have something. For myself, I usually have a character voice. Not always, but usually have a character voice. So for me, if I put my character voice on, I'm talking in character. That's me in character. I'm saying what my character is saying, the way that they're saying it, to who they're saying it to. However, if you're in a group or a gaming community that doesn't do a lot of character voices, you should have some way of symbolizing whether or not you're in character or out of character. And like Dustin said, that could be with a talking stick, or it could be something as simple as if I pick up my D20 and I have that in my hand, now I'm taking actions in character.
There you go.
And being ready to roll the dice when something happens in character. Anything else before we move on to Tricks of the Trade?
Well, let's retcon the first half of the show, and then we'll go back to...
As a DM, I'm going to go ahead and say this is not something that I'm going to retcon. Let's stick with it as it has happened.
All right, fair enough.
All right, let's move on to Tricks of the Trade. Today in Tricks of the Trade, let's each give an idea of a scenario that we would be absolutely 100% okay retconning, and a lot of time has passed.
Ooh.
That's a tricky one. It's going to take a minute to probably process, but
it's going to have to come to a PC death in some sort of a major way, and it's got to be something more than just a bonus wasn't calculated. It's got to be something like the character died to a fireball, but they actually were immune to fire for this reason.
Okay.
And something dramatic that the verisimilitude of the game would have been completely lost if we didn't go back and retcon that. But I can't imagine a full session passes, I don't think I'd ever retcon under any circumstances for any reason, period, hard stop. But if it's been a couple of hours of gameplay and it affects a character death, and it's more than just a bonus. Once you're beyond a certain point, the bonus is on the dice, not calculating a +2. Okay, at that point, I'm not going to retcon it because enough time has passed. But if it's something like you died to fire and you're immune to fire for whatever reason, okay. It's hard.
How under that circumstance? Because obviously, you or me, we're going to run into a scenario where that could happen. We've seen things like that happen. I had this spell on. I'm immune to fire right now because of this spell. Or I take 30 less points of damage from fire.
Substantially,
that wouldn't have even, finished me off. But both of us would still want to make it happen in stories so that we didn't actually have to change what happened, but we still somehow changed the outcome where the characters are sitting at right now. I mean, I could see, sure, the fire got through, but my protection actually gave me some sort of a natural regeneration in this point instead of just blocking out everything that's happened, and all of a sudden the character wakes back up and says,
sure,
the fire was cleansing me, or some other thing that happened in story.
Fire is actually the easiest, I think, because there's a lot of consequences in the real world of fire damage. I mean, smoke inhalation is what comes up to me.
Sure.
Maybe the character didn't actually die from fire damage. Maybe they simply inhaled so much smoke it knocked them unconscious.
Yeah, that
and
would
then
work.
once then they had a coughing fit and woke back up, and their hit points are still there, but they looked dead because they were hardly breathing at the time because of all the smoke inhalation. So there's a way to do it in story. If you just, the GM needs to take a moment. The longer the time has passed and the further back you have to retcon, the more time the GM has to spend figuring out how to make that story make sense, because you've already lost so much of the continuity going back. So if you're going to not go back but still change the perceived outcome, it needs to be really, really believable to the whole group. And the only way that happens is if you say, okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll be right back to the table. And you spend that time to think about how you're going to make the story continuity fit what had already taken place, so you don't have to do a true hard retcon back to that moment.
Awesome. Yeah, I think for myself, I'm going to go ahead and say, I think you're right along the lines of there has to be something pretty dramatic like a character death. I would say I think the classic one that you're okay with retconning in some way is going to be that TPK.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even if the dice all happen the way that they should happen, but the whole party dies, and that's not the way that the story needs to go right now, find a way to retcon it, but also keep that piece of the story real.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, you had this big fight, the whole party was TPK'd. Instead, what happens now is they wake up. That was a dream about what they're about to face. And then you go through the action again, give them one more opportunity. Might be a little far-fetched. In certain stories, that's going to fit really well. Or perhaps they do die. Now they have some sort of thing. Well, okay, yes, I'm going to retcon this and give them an opportunity to go through it again. Now they have the opportunity to go back and maybe warn themselves what's coming as sort of like spiritual afterthoughts of what their soul was, you know?
There's a lot of ways you can go with that without doing what I would call an actual retcon, continuing the narrative in some way. I mean, Deus Ex Machina is kind of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and you didn't even know about this, but this is what's been going on. I despise the dream. I think that's way overplayed. Unless if you've already built into your story, like in my Tolis campaign, one of the characters is a dreamer who does have prophetic dreams.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, I could almost stomach the notion of, oh, this is what you dreamed and you wake up in a fit and sweat because of all of this. But short of that being an already existing story element, I hate the dream. I love the notion of the PCs continue in the afterlife and making that part of the story. I love the idea of you actually wake up in a goblin's cook pot. Or, and you got to figure out what to go on. I like less the notion of you are rescued because it kind of removes the notion of the players being the heroes. But in the right story, in a gritty story, that actually could introduce them to major NPCs that could be tied into the story. So you can play around with it. Think of what else is going on in the world when that TPK took place. And if any potential ally of the PCs would see the benefit to rescuing them, and then tie that element in early.
Well, and you can always, I think, a really smart one to fall back on for DMs in a scenario like that where you have a TPK is treated as a TPU, a total party unconsciousness. Everybody didn't die. They all wake up later chained and in a prison cell somewhere or a jail cell where they have now an escape arc that they're going to have to do, and get to play with some of those fun get out of jail stories, because that's always a good time anyways.
And it just depends on the nature of what killed them. I mean, obviously, if they were attacked by bandits or they attacked by guards or some sort of humanoid foe, that makes a lot of sense. If they were attacked by a hungry dragon, that makes a little less sense. So you got to kind of play with the story a little bit.
That's true. Very good point. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on today, Dustin. We will all see you next time. We know you'll be back on the show many times throughout this season.
Looking forward.
Let's move on to our knowledge check. In today's knowledge check, I want to talk about some of the ideas presented in an online blog known as DMing with Charisma, which you can find through a quick Google search. And the blog post is from the 13th of December, 2016 by Messenger Death, and it's called The Art of the Retcon. And inside this blog, there's a lot of great advice that is given on the topic of retconning. It talks about what it is, ways that it has been used in campaigns that they've done. But I think one of the most important things that they talk about is how important it is not to retcon away a player's moment of glory or something that ended up being fun at the table. So accepting the rule of cool over the other rules. If retconning would take away something that the group experienced and was elated over or really enjoyed, then it shouldn't be done. That would be a very good keystone to understanding whether or not a retcon is acceptable at the moment. The post also goes on to talk about one time when retconning should be used freely, and that is when it is around rules question. It talks about if a player tries to do something just crazy off the wall and it's not clear to the DM if the rules would even allow it or make it possible. So the DM might not know whether it's legal. They might just come up with a decision at the moment and then spend a few minutes or whatever looking up the rules. That can take a long time, especially if you're using paper books and you don't have search functions. But they recommend that the DM makes a decision and then has the chance later to verify, sometimes between sessions, and then use the correct rules. Now, this sort of retcon might not actually change anything that has happened. What instead it might be used for is to say, hey, from now on, this is how the rules will happen going forward, which I think is a much better way to handle that scenario. I don't like leaving a session and then coming back and changing what has happened when you return. And I think that was sort of agreed upon by Dustin and I in our discussion. And the final piece of advice that is given in the blog that I would like to share with you is their suggestion of always talking and communicating with your players if you're going to change anything major. It could be a change that enhances your game, but it might not be something that they're fond of changing. So make sure that it is used collaboratively as well. You're telling a collaborative story. If you're going to change part of it, make sure that they're cool with it and it makes sense to them. And if not, maybe it's not the right place for a retcon. That's it for today, my cyclothids. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, please jump on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or on whatever platform you use for your podcast. And please give us a review. Those 5-star reviews are super helpful in improving our rankings, getting out to more listeners, and hopefully eventually getting some nice show sponsors. So please give me just a moment of your time and do that for me as a favor. I would really appreciate it. And as always, you can find me on Instagram at dungeons_dragons_psychology. You can also email me at any time, dungeonsdragonpsychology@gmail.com. That's all one word. Until next time, cyclothids, we'll see you next session.